Ba-da-da-da-da-da-da. Hello? Ladies and gentlemen, my intro. Ba-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-ba. Dun dun. Okay. Welcome to the next thrilling and exciting and ebullient, effervescent and inimical, irrevocable, irreplaceable, irreproachable episode of the fantastic, astounding, amazing, shocking, adventuresome, saturnine, and taciturn, loquacious reading cow from another world with bedtime stories for the baby thing show that this is. Oh God, it's Sunday morning. We're on lockdown with the coronavirus, and the only one who can save us is Donald. Hey, the poor guy, it's like working around the clock, fingering those golf clubs. He's gonna hit that coronavirus with the line drive. And taxpayer expense. Okay. So, but back to another world, which I wish I was really in at this point. But anyway, 9. How Theodora, most depraved of all courtesans, won his love. His. Who is he? Is that what we call an ambiguous pronoun? I think it is. It means Justinian. Okay, so Theodora married Justinian. Okay. He took a wife, and in what manner she was born and bred and wedded to this man, tore up the Roman Empire by the very roots. Oh, wait. He took a wife, and in what manner she was born and bred and wedded to this man, tore up the Roman Empire by the very roots. I shall now relate. I'm going to relate the manner in which she, ruined us. Okay. Cassius was the keeper of wild beasts used in the amphitheater in Constantinople. He belonged to the Green faction and was nicknamed the Bear Keeper. This man, during the rule of Anastasius, fell sick and died, leaving 3 daughters named Comito, Theodora, Anastasia, of whom the eldest was not yet 7 years old. His widow took a second husband, who with her undertook to keep up Cassius's family and profession, but Asterius, the dancing master of the Greens, on being bribed by another, removed this office from them and assigned it to the man who gave him the money. For the dancing masters had the power of distributing such positions as they wished. When this woman saw the populace assembled in the amphitheater, she placed laurel wreaths on her daughters' heads and in their hands, and sent them out to sit on the ground in the attitude of suppliants. The Greens eyed this mute appeal with indifference, but the Blues were moved to bestow on the children an equal office, since their own animal keeper had just died. When these children reached the age of girlhood, their mother put them on the local stage, for they were fair to look upon. She sent them forth, however, not all at the same time, but as each one seemed to her to have reached a suitable age. Comito had indeed already become one of the leading hetairai, high-class prostitutes of the day. Theodora, the second sister, dressed in a little tunic with sleeves like a slave girl, waited on Comito, and used to follow her about, carrying on her shoulders the bench on which her favorite sister was wont to sit at public gatherings. Now Theodora was still too young to know the normal relation of man with maid, but consented to the unnatural violence of villainous slaves who, following their masters to the theater, employed their leisure in this infamous manner. And for some time in a brothel she suffered much misuse. You wonder how people get brutalized, Well, there you have it, right there. They can become mean as a rattlesnake. Okay. But as soon as she arrived at the age of youth and was now ready for the world, her mother put her on the stage. Forthwith she became a courtesan, and such, as the ancient Greeks used to call a common one at that, for she was not a flute or harp player, nor was she even trained to dance, but only gave her youth to anyone she met, in utter abandonment. Her general favors included, of course, the actors in the theater, and in their productions she took part in the low comedy scenes, for she was very funny and a good mimic, and immediately became popular in this art. There was no shame in the girl, and no one ever saw her dismayed. No role was too scandalous for her to accept without a blush. She was the kind of comedian who delights the audience by letting herself be cuffed and slapped on the cheeks, and makes them guffaw by raising her skirts to reveal to the spectators those feminine secrets here and there which custom veils from the eyes of the opposite sex, which with pretended laziness she mocked her lovers, and coquettishly adopting ever new ways of embracing, was able to keep in a constant turmoil the hearts of the sophisticated. And she did not wait to be asked by anyone she met, but on the contrary, with inviting jest and a comic flaunting of her skirts, herself tempted all men who passed by, especially those who were adolescents. On the field of pleasure she was never defeated. Often she would go picnicking with 10 young men or more, in the flower of their strength and virility, and dallied with them all the whole night through. When they wearied of the sport, she would approach their servants, perhaps 30 in number, and fight a duel with each of these, and even thus found no allayment of her craving. Once, visiting the house of an illustrious gentleman, they say she mounted the projecting corner of her dining couch, pulled up the front of her dress without a blush, and thus carelessly showed her wantonness, and though she flung wide 3 gates to the ambassadors of Cupid, she lamented that nature had not similarly unlocked the straits of her bosom, that she might there have contrived further welcome to his emissaries. What? Frequently she conceived, but as she employed every artifice, immediately a miscarriage was straightway effected. Often, even in the theater, in the sight of all the people, she removed her costume and stood nude in their midst, except for a girdle about the groin. Not that she was abashed at revealing that, too, to the audience, but because there was a law against appearing altogether naked on the stage without at least this much of a fig leaf. Covered thus with a ribbon, she would sink down on the stage floor and recline on her back. Slaves to whom the duty was entrusted would then scatter grains of barley above into the calyx of this passion flower, whence geese, trained for the purpose, would next pick the grains one by one with their bills and eat. When she rose, it was not with a blush, but she seemed rather to glory in the performance, for she was not only impudent herself, but endeavored to make everybody else as audacious. Often, when she was alone with other actors, she would undress in their midst and arch her back provocatively, advertising like a peacock, both to those who had experience of her, and to those who had not yet had that privilege, her trained suppleness. So perverse was her wantonness, that she should have hid not only the customary part of her person, as other women do, but her face as well. Thus those who were intimate with her straightway recognized from that very fact to be perverts, at any more respectable man who chanced upon her in the forum avoided her and withdrew in haste, lest the hem of his mantle touching such a creature might be thought to share in her pollution. For to those who saw her, especially at dawn, she was a bird of ill omen, and toward her fellow actresses she was as savage as a scorpion, for she was very malicious. Later, she followed Hecebulus, a Tyrian, who had been made governor of Pentapolis, serving him in the basest of ways. But finally she quarreled with him and was sent summarily away. Consequently, she found herself destitute of the means of life, which she proceeded to earn by prostitution, as she had done before this adventure. She came thus to Alexandria, and when traversing all the east, worked her way to Constantinople, in every city plying a trade which it is safer, I fancy, in the sight of God, not to name too clearly, as if the devil were determined there be no land on earth that should not know the sins of Theodora. Thus was this woman born and bred, and her name was a byword beyond that of other common wenches on the tongues of all men. Everybody got to know Theodora. But when she came back to Constantinople, Justinian fell violently in love with her. At first he kept her only as a mistress, though he raised her to patrician rank. Through him, Theodora was able immediately to acquire an unholy power and exceedingly great riches. She seemed to him the sweetest thing in the world, and like all lovers, he desired to please his charmer with every possible favor and requite her with all his wealth. The extravagance added fuel to the flames of passion. With her now to help spend his money, he plundered the people more than ever, not only in the capital, but throughout the Roman Empire. As both of them had for a long time been of the Blue Party, they gave this faction almost complete control of the affairs of state. It was long afterward that the worst of the evil was checked in the following manner. Justinian had been ill for several days, and during this illness was in such peril of his life that it was even said that he had died, and the Blues, who had been committing such crimes as I had mentioned, went so far as to kill Hypatius, a gentleman of no mean importance, in broad daylight in the church of St. Sophia. The cry of horror at this crime came to the emperor's ears, and everyone about him seized the opportunity of pointing out the enormity of what was going on in Justinian's absence from public affairs. And they enumerated from the beginning how many crimes had been committed. The emperor then ordered the prefect of the city to punish these offenses. This man was one Theodotus, nicknamed the Pumpkin. He made a thorough investigation and was able to apprehend many of the guilty and sentenced them to death, though many others were not found out and escaped. They were destined to perish later together with the Roman Empire. Justinian, unexpectedly restored to health, straightway undertook to put Theodorus to death as a poisoner and a magician. But since he had no proof on which to condemn the man, he tortured friends of his until they were compelled to say the words that would wrongfully ruin him. When everyone else stood to one side, and only in silence lamented the plot against Theodorus, one man, Procopius, the quaestor, dared to say openly that the man was innocent of the charge against him, and in no way merited death. Thanks to him, Theodorus was permitted by the emperor to be exiled to Jerusalem, but learning there that men were being sent to do away with him, he hid himself in the church for the rest of his life until he died. And this was the fate of Theodorus. Theodotus. But after this, the Blues became the most prudent of men, for they ventured no longer to continue their offenses, even though they might have transgressed more fearlessly than before. And the proof of this is that when a few of them later showed such courage, no punishment at all befell them. For those who had the power to punish always gave these gangsters time to escape, tacitly encouraging the rest to trample upon the laws. 10. How Justinian created a new law permitting him to marry a courtesan. Now, as long as the former empress was alive, Justinian was unable to find a way to make Theodora his wedded wife. In this one matter she opposed him as in nothing else, for the lady abhorred vice, being a rustic and of barbarian descent, as I have shown. She was never able to do any real good because of her continued ignorance of the affairs of state. She dropped her original name for fear people would think it ridiculous, and adopted the name of Euphemia when she came to the palace. But finally her death removed this obstacle to Justinian's desire. Justin, doting and utterly senile, was now the laughingstock of his subjects. He was disregarded by everyone because of his inability to oversee state affairs. But Justinian they all served with considerable awe. His hand was in everything, and his passion for turmoil created universal consternation. It was then that he undertook to complete his marriage with Theodora, But as it was impossible for a man of senatorial rank to make a courtesan his wife, this being forbidden by ancient law, he made the emperor nullify this ordinance by creating a new one, permitting him to wed Theodora and consequently making it possible for anyone else to marry a courtesan. Immediately after this, he seized the power of the emperor, veiling his usurpation with transparent pretexts, for he was proclaimed colleague of his uncle as emperor of the Romans by the questionable legality of an election inspired by terror. So Justinian and Theodora ascended the imperial throne 3 days before Easter, a time indeed when even making visits or greeting one's friends is forbidden. And not many days later Justin died of an illness after a reign of 9 years. Justinian was now the sole monarch, together, of course, with Theodora. Thus it was that Theodora, though born and brought up as I have related, rose to royal dignity over all obstacles, for no thought of shame came to Justinian in marrying her, though he might have taken his pick of the noblest born, most highly educated, most modest, carefully nurtured, virtuous, and beautiful virgins of all the ladies in the whole Roman Empire, a maiden, as they say, with upstanding breasts. What? Instead, he preferred to make his own what had been common to all men alike, careless of all her revealed history, took in wedlock a woman who was not only guilty of every other contamination, but boasted of her many abortions. There's a Holy Roman Emperor for you. Christian Roman Empire, Catholic, yeah. But, you know, okay, Theodora, you gotta realize that if you create a world where people are subjected to the kind of life that, you know, she was subjected to, there's going to be consequences, you know. And this is like, it's not because, you know, it's like you don't want to subject people in your society to that kind of, you know, this is a caveat, or, you know, this is I digress. But it's not whether or not a person is a natural born jerk or whatever, you know. Maybe they were a jerk, but if you have a society where people are subjected to this sort of life, you know, you're going to have to expect there's going to be consequences that, you know, they're going to come eventually. So anyway, I need hardly mention any other proof of the character of this man, for all the perversity of his soul was completely displayed in this union, which alone was an ample interpreter, witness, and historian of his shamelessness. For when a man once disregards the disgrace of his actions and is willing to brave the contempt of society, no path of lawlessness is hereafter taboo to him, but with unflinching countenance he advances easily and without a scruple to acts of the deepest infamy. However, not a single member of even the Senate, seeing this disgrace befalling the state, dared to complain or forbid the event, but all of them bowed down before her as if she were a goddess. Nor was there a priest who showed any resentment, but all hastened to greet her as Highness, and the populace, who had seen her before on the stage, directly raised its hands to proclaim itself her slave, and in fact and in name. Nor did any soldier grumble at being ordered to risk the perils of war for the benefit of Theodora. Nor was there any man on earth who ventured to oppose her. Confronted with this disgrace, they all yielded, I suppose, to necessity, for it was as if fate were giving proof of its power to control mortal affairs as malignantly as it pleases, showing that its decrees need not always be according to reason or human propriety. Thus does destiny sometimes raise mortals suddenly to lofty heights in defiance of reason, and challenge to all outcries of injustice, but admits no obstacle, urging on his favorites to the appointed goal without let or hindrance. But as this is the will of God, so let it befall and be written. God ordained it, folks. Okay. Now Theodora was fair of face and of a very graceful though small person. Her complexion was moderately colorful, if somewhat pale, and her eyes were dazzling and vivacious. All eternity would not be long enough to allow one to tell her escapades while she was on the stage, but the few details I have mentioned above should be sufficient to demonstrate the woman's character to future generations. What she and her husband did together must now be briefly described, for neither did anything without the consent of the other. For some time it was generally supposed they were totally different in mind and action, but later it was revealed that their apparent disagreement had been arranged so that their subjects might not unanimously revolt against them, but instead be divided in opinion. Thus they split the Christians into two parties, each pretending to take the part of one side, thus confusing both, as I shall soon show. And then they ruined both political factions. Theodora feigned to support the Blues with all her power, encouraging them to take offensive against the opposing party and perform the most outrageous deeds of violence, while Justinian, affecting to be vexed and secretly jealous of her, also pretended he could not openly oppose her orders, and thus they gave the impression often that they were acting in opposition. Then he would rule that the Blues must be punished for their crimes, and she would angrily complain that against her will she was defeated by her husband. However, the Blue partisans, as I have said, seemed cautious, for they did not violate their neighbors as much as they might have done. And in legal disputes, each of the two would pretend to favor one of the litigants and compel the man with the worst case to win. And so they robbed both disputants of most of the property at issue. In the same way, the emperor, taking many persons into his intimacy, gave them offices by power of which they could defraud the state to the limits of their ambition. And as soon as they had collected enough plunder, they would fall out of favor with Theodora and straightway be ruined. At first he would affect great sympathy in their behalf, but soon he would somehow lose his confidence in them, and an air of doubt would darken his zeal in their behalf. Then Theodora would use them shamefully, while he, unconscious, as it were, of what was being done to them, and confiscated their properties and boldly enjoyed their wealth. By such well-planned hypocrisies, they confused the public, and pretending to be at variance with each other, were able to establish a firm and mutual tyranny. 11. How the defender of the faith ruined his subjects. As soon as Justinian came into power, he turned everything upside down. Whatever had been before by law, he now introduced into the government, while he revoked all established customs, as if he had been given the robes of an emperor on the condition that he could turn everything topsy-turvy. Existing offices he abolished and invented new ones for the management of public affairs. He did the same thing to the laws and to the regulations of the army, and this reason was not any improvement of justice or any advantage, but simply that everything might be new and named after himself. And whatever was beyond his power to abolish, he renamed after himself anyway. Of the plundering of property or the murder of men, no weariness ever overtook him. As soon as he had looted all the houses of the wealthy, he looked around for others. Meanwhile, throwing away the spoils of his previous robberies and subsidies to barbarians or senseless building extravagances, and when he had ruined perhaps myriads in this mad looting, he immediately sat down to plan how he could do likewise to others in even greater number. As the Romans were now at peace with all the world, and he had no other means of satisfying his lust for slaughter, he set the barbarians all to fighting each other, and for no reason at all. He sent for the Hun chieftains, and with idiotic magnanimity gave them large sums of money, alleging he did this to secure their friendship. This, as I have said, he had also done in Justin's time. These Huns, as soon as they had got this money, sent it together with their soldiers to others of their chieftains with the word to make inroads into the land of the emperor, so that they might collect further tribute from him, or buy them off in a second peace. Thus the Huns enslaved the Roman Empire and were paid by the emperor to keep on doing it. This encouraged still others of them to rob the poor Romans, and after their pillaging, they too were further rewarded by the gracious emperor. In this way all the Huns, for when it was not one tribe of them it was another, continuously overran and laid waste the empire. For the barbarians were led by many different chieftains, and the war, thanks to Justinian's senseless generosity, was thus endlessly protracted. Consequently, No place, mountain or cave, or any other spot in Roman territory during this time remained uninjured, and many regions were pillaged more than 5 times. These misfortunes, and those that were caused by the Medes, Saracens, Slavs, Antes, and the rest of the barbarians, I described in my previous works. But as I said in the preface to this narrative, the real cause of these calamities remain to be told here. To Chosroes also he paid many centenaries in behalf of peace, and then with unreasonable arbitrariness caused the breaking of the truce by making every effort to secure the friendship of Alamandor and his Huns. Who had been in alliance with the Persians, but this I freely discussed in my chapters on the subject. Moreover, while he was encouraging civil strife and frontier warfare to confound the Romans, with only one thought in his mind, that the earth should run red with human blood and he might acquire more and more booty, he invented a new means of murdering his subjects. Now, among the Christians in the entire Roman Empire, there are many dissenting doctrines, which are called heresies by the established church, such as those of the Montanists and Sabbatians, and whatever others cause the minds of men to wander from the true path. All of these beliefs he ordered to be abolished, in their place taken by the orthodox dogma, threatening among the punishments for disobedience loss of the heretic's right to will property to his children or other relatives. Now, the churches of these so-called heretics, especially those belonging to Arian dissenters, were almost incredibly wealthy. Neither all the Senate put together, nor the greatest other unit of the Roman Empire had anything in property comparable to that of these churches, for their gold and silver treasures and stores of precious stones were beyond telling or numbering. They owned mansions and whole villages, land all over the world, and everything else that is counted as wealth among men. As none of the previous emperors had molested these churches, many men, even those of the Orthodox faith, got their livelihood by working on their estates. But the Emperor Justinian, in confiscating these properties, at the same time took away what for many people had been their only means of earning a living. Agents were sent everywhere to force whomever they chanced upon to renounce the faith of their fathers. This which seemed impious to rustic people caused them to rebel against those who gave them such an order. Thus many perished at the hands of the persecuting faction, and others did away with themselves foolishly, thinking the holier course of two evils. But most of them by far quitted the land of their fathers and fled the country. The Montanists who dwelt in Phrygia shut themselves up in their churches, set them on fire, and ascended to glory in the flames, and thenceforth the whole Roman Empire was a scene of massacre and flight. A similar law was then passed against the Samaritans, which threw Palestine into an indescribable turmoil. Those indeed who lived in my own Caesarea and in the other cities, deciding it silly to suffer harsh treatment over a ridiculous trifle of dogma, took the name of Christians in exchange for the one they had borne before, by which precaution they were able to avoid the perils of the new law. The most reputable and better class of these citizens, once they adopted this religion, decided to remain faithful to it. The majority, however, as if in spite for having not voluntarily but by compulsion of law been in the belief of their fathers, soon slipped away into the Manichaean sect and what is known as polytheism. The country people, however, banded together and determined to take arms against the emperor, choosing as their candidate for the throne a bandit named Julian, son of Sabarus, and for a time they held their own against the imperial troops, but finally, defeated in battle, were cut down together with their leader. 10 myriads of men are said to have perished in this engagement, and the most fertile country on earth thus became destitute of farmers. To the Christian owners of these lands, the affair brought great hardship, for while their profits from these properties were annihilated, they had to pay heavy annual taxes on them to the emperor for the rest of their lives, and secured no remission of this burden. Next he turned his attention to those called Gentiles, torturing their persons and plundering their lands. Of this group, those who decided to become nominal Christians saved themselves for the time being, but it was not long before these too were caught performing libations and sacrifices and other unholy rites. And how he treated the Christians shall be told hereafter. After this, he passed a law prohibiting pederasty, a law pointed not at offenses committed after this degree, but at those who could be convicted of having practiced the vice in the past. The conduct of the prosecution was utterly illegal. Sentence was passed when there was no accuser. The word of one man or boy, and perhaps a slave, compelled against his will to bear witness against his owner, was defined as sufficient evidence. Those who were convicted were castrated and then exhibited in public parade. All at the start of this persecution was directed only at the start. This persecution was directed only at those who were of the Green Party, were reputed to be especially wealthy, and had otherwise aroused jealousy. The emperor's malice was also directed against the astrologer. Accordingly, magistrates appointed to punish thieves also abused the astrologers, for no other reason than that they belonged to this profession, whipping them on the back and parading them on camels throughout the city, though they were old men and in every way respectable, and with no reproach against them except that they studied the science of the stars while living in such a city. Consequently, there was a constant stream of immigration, not only to the land of the barbarians, but to places farthest remote from the Romans, and in every country and city one could see crowds of foreigners. For in order to escape persecution, each would lightly exchange his native land for another, as if his own country had been taken by an enemy. Ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of another thrilling and exciting and edifying, inimical, irrevocable, irreplaceable, and irreproachable, amicable and amenable episode of the Reading Kaufman of the World with the Anecdota of Procopius, with bedtime stories, show, which this is, until next time when we continue the saga of Justinian's Roman Empire in the, what is this, the 6th century? I forget. I think it's the 5th and 6th, partially the 5th and then the 6th century. So if you want to know what it was like, this is where you got to come. Until that time, goodbye.